Bonjour, buenos dias, and ciao, ni hao, what's up? It's me, Mr. Jordan. Today we're going to be talking about The Perks of Being a Wallflower by chbosky, and we're getting to a couple specific themes in the third section of the book, part 3. In part 3 of The Perks of Being a Wallflower, the main character, Charlie, really starts to break down. His mental health has been affected clearly by issues of trauma and violence in his family, and in this third section of the book, we see the plot take a drastic shift, and Charlie really starts to sort of go off the proverbial deep end. He's losing control both of his behaviors and his emotions as a direct result of not being able to cope or handle the sort of pressures and anxieties that he's feeling socially and at school, and really about being an outsider and a wallflower, and how his identity has come to be shaped by this inability to fit in or to feel normal and to be a part of those people around him. Right at the beginning of the section, Charlie tells us that his mind played hopscotch on him. So he gives us this image of sort of how his mind is jumping all over the place and really how the pieces of the puzzle are starting to come apart. He also hints at the possibility that some of this might be from taking drugs or alcohol. He tells us he's tried LSD for the first time, and he also tells us that as his social life is sort of crumbling around him, he starts to get more involved with drugs and smoking pot and drinking alcohol with some of his new friends like Patrick and Sam and even Bob and some of those sort of peripheral or secondary characters. In the first key quote, Charlie tells us, quote, "I feel like a big faker because I've been putting my life back together and nobody knows it. It's hard to sit in my bedroom and read like I always did. It's even hard to talk to my brother on the phone. His team finished third in the nation. Nobody told him we missed the game live because of me." And so, again, we see this idea that Charlie's starting to blame himself. So he thinks that the reason his family didn't get to participate in the game or missed out on his brother's great achievement is because he messed up, right? Charlie messed up again. It's all Charlie's fault. And this is sort of coupled with this idea that he's not really connecting with his other family members, right? He's not really connecting with his siblings. He can't talk to his brother on the phone anymore. He can't sit still and listen. He's also saying that he can't even sit still and read a book anymore, which really connects to this idea of his mind hopscotching or sort of spinning out of control. Like, I like to imagine him almost as like a top, right? Like he's been set in motion and he's spinning fast, and we know he's going to lose control from this because he's no longer able to sit still, to steady himself. That reference to Zen and to sort of mysticism from the last chapter is like gone out the window now. Later on in the library, he even tells us he's having a kind of attack that sounds a lot like a panic attack or maybe a full sort of nervous breakdown. He says, quote, "I started breathing fast in the library. It was really bad because I remembered some of the schizophrenic kids in the hospital when I was little. And it didn't help this was the day after I noticed that all the kids were wearing their new Christmas clothes." And remember, like, Christmas is a trigger for Charlie. It's when his aunt died, it's when his birthday is, it's when the car accident took place. It's kind of his least favorite time of year. So he's telling us this because we know this is his trigger. "I noticed all the kids were wearing the new Christmas clothes, so I decided to wear my new suit from Patrick to school and was teased mercilessly for 9 straight hours. It was such a bad day, I skipped my first class." So really we understand here 2 things. One, he's wearing a suit that's not really appropriate for school, and it's like a private thing with him and his friends, right? It's a signifier that he's a part of their clique or their clique. He's with them, but they're kind of outsiders at the school. They aren't like jocks or nerds or goths or rockers or whatever. They aren't emo. They're some other thing. And this suit is like him wearing a flag or waving a flag saying like, "I don't fit in, I'm not normal." And it's again just this reiteration of how Charlie doesn't pick up on social cues. He misses the social norms. And the identity or collective identities that are taking place at the school, he doesn't identify with those collective identities. And that's an issue, right? That he can't identify with anyone else around him. I think there's also sort of this idea that Charlie is maybe a little bit manic or bipolar. Like he experiences these wild swings. And that's this image again of hopscotching or spinning or falling out of control or being out of place. Ultimately, it's this idea that he cannot be still, right? He cannot be present. And so he tells us, I feel great, I really mean it. I have to remember this for next time I'm having a terrible week. Have you ever done that? It's like, well, no, when I'm having a great week, I don't think about my next terrible week. He, of course, can't stay present even in his happiness or contentment, though. You feel really bad and then it goes away and you don't know why. I try to remind myself when I feel great like this, that there will be another terrible week coming someday. So I should store up as many great details as I can, so during the terrible week, I can remember those details and believe that I feel great again. It doesn't work a lot, but I think it's very important to try. This is a terrible strategy, right? If you're having a great week, don't try and recall your terrible weeks for the next time. He's like not at all in the present. He's thinking, okay, I used to feel terrible and now I feel good, but I may feel terrible again in the future. So I'm gonna pull on the past to look for the future. Like, it's such a confused, spinning idea. It's anything but present. And ultimately, it's about his inability to be in the moment, to live within himself, right? He looks to the past, which is a form of sort of depressive nostalgia. He stresses out about the future, a form of anxiety. He's unable to live within himself, right? He's having serious self-esteem issues. I think there's even this example where physically we see how Charlie's lack of control, or the fact that he's sort of falling off of a cliff or spinning into this unknown chaotic place, it's starting to affect his physical beliefs, right? He's having this panic attack in the library, and then he's also becoming unable to complete sort of basic physical routines. Like when he's trying to help his mother, he says, so I tried to help my mother in the kitchen, but I dropped the casserole. So she told me to read in my room until father came home. But reading is what started this whole mess in the first place. And so he's struggling with like really basic level stuff, right? Helping his mom, just being a kitchen helper, passing a casserole dish, sitting in his room and reading. These aren't complex or hard to figure out tasks. They're just simple, and he's no longer able to even perform those, even sit in his class, right? He's skipping class now. We're seeing all the warning signs of a sort of major crisis that's about to take place in Charlie's life. And in the plot point, what's happening here is the anxiety, the tension is cranking up, right, towards the climax. The climax is a high point, good or bad. It's the most suspenseful, intense moment. And now we can see the frenetic pace building up inside Charlie's internal anxiety. Charlie also starts to make really poor decisions and then immediately regret them, which shows us he's kind of becoming impulsive, or again, just losing the handle. He can't control himself. And he does this in the bookstore with hiding the book or stealing the book, and then immediately regrets it and tells us, when I walked home, all I could think was what a terrible thing it was I just did. And I started crying. And then later again, he says, I just kind of put my feelings away somewhere after that. I left school, walked around, and didn't get home until 1 o'clock in the morning. He says, I definitely think I should have been honest then, but to tell you the truth, I was getting as mad as I used to get playing sports. So doing these simple, mundane tasks, going to class, reading a book, trying to get a gift for Mary Elizabeth, his girlfriend, right? Going to the bookstore, returning the gift. These simple, mundane things are infuriating him, and it's showing us that something is triggering Charlie, something not normal. And I would suggest it's the build up towards Christmas, right? We're getting closer to that all-important date, and that's what's ultimately gonna set Charlie off or cause him to really collapse. So finally, all this build up and this sort of chaotic spinning or out of control nature of what Charlie is doing, it comes to a head when they're playing this kind of truth or dare, spin the bottle game, and Charlie has to kiss the prettiest girl in the room. So of course we all know he should kiss Mary Elizabeth, right? There's no choice here. He's a girlfriend, she's sitting beside him. Sure, we know in some objective, subjective, whatever sense, Charlie thinks Sam's the prettiest girl in the world. But you can't do that. There's obvious social reasons, obvious social norms. You cannot get up, go across the room, kiss someone else's partner in front of them. It's just objectively not accepted. But of course he does it anyways. And when he does it, there's a huge fallout. And where does the fallout happen? Sure, it happens with Sam and her boyfriend, with Mary Elizabeth. But more than 3 of them, it's in Charlie, right? He internalizes the guilt of having made such a massive mistake. Even though he kind of knew it was a massive mistake, he was unable to stop himself, right? He's unable to control his own life. And that's what we see when someone falls apart. They're no longer able to control their own life and their decisions. And the anxiety and frustration and rage bubble out, and then they just fall apart, explode. As we see, his actions, his thoughts are hopscotching all over the place. And he tells us in the end, I know that I brought this upon myself. I know that I deserve this, which is terrible, right? Nobody deserves this. I'll do anything not to be this way. I'll do anything to make it up to everyone, and not to have to see a psychiatrist who explains to me about being passive aggressive, and not to have to take the medicine he gives me, which is expensive for my dad, and not to have to talk about bad memories with him, or be nostalgic about bad things. But we know that this is what Charlie does anyways. This is irony. He already obsesses about bad things and nostalgia and his past memories. He lives with all that guilt about his aunt and his family and the fights. He tells us these stories non-stop about his grandmother and his parents and all the trouble and brutal stuff. Well, that's all weighing him down because he chooses to bring it in and internalize it. He can't accept the present and get over that past, right? He can't let it go. And then he tells us, I just wish someone would tell me, God or parents or Sam or my sister, what's wrong with me. Just tell me how to be different in a way that makes sense, to make this all go away. And this is kind of a frightening moment because we realize he no longer wants to be in himself or a part of himself. And that's a very scary precipice or ledge to be on. And ultimately his result is that he goes and procures drugs and he starts depending on abuse, like substance abuse. And ultimately, Charlie resorts to abusing substances again, to smoking weed and to drinking, to oblivion, right, to destroy his mind. So he tells us, after a week of not talking to anyone, I finally called Bob. I know that's wrong, but I didn't know what else to do. I asked him if he had anything I could buy. He said he had a 1/4 ounce of pot left. So I took some of the Easter money and bought it. I've been smoking it all the time since. So this section, this whole 3rd chapter, 3rd part of the book is essentially Charlie is coming undone. He's unwound himself. The successes, the friendships he's made, right? He builds up these strong relationships with Sam and Patrick, and then later with Mary Elizabeth. He has the girlfriend that he's been so worried about getting. He's participating in culture and friendship and starting to form this identity by having friends around him, but it's too much for him. So he goes and destroys it and ruins everything. And then he takes the blame and blames himself because he doesn't believe he's worth it, right? It's a self-esteem issue. He doesn't think he's worth the love of his friends, so he goes out and destroys those friendships. A sad state of affairs. Poor Charlie. Thanks so much for watching. Sub to the channel, give me a like if you're into it. I will be back with one more video about the Percy being a wallflower when we wrap up the book and talk about the 4th section. I'm Mr. Jordan, and I hope you learned from that. Take care.